Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we are bringing you 7 of the most disturbing true horror stories ever documented from the Cascade Mountain forests, where the ancient woods harbor mysteries that defy all rational explanation. These are not works of fiction or campfire tales passed down through generations. These are authentic accounts from park rangers, surveyors, hikers, and wilderness professionals who encountered something in those dark forests that forever changed their understanding of reality. Each story has been meticulously compiled from official reports, witness interviews, and documented evidence that cannot be easily dismissed. The Cascades stretch across hundreds of miles of remote wilderness where disappearances remain unsolved and phenomena continue to occur that science cannot explain. If you are drawn to genuine horror content rooted in documented reality, subscribe to Buried Files and activate the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into the unexplained. After you hear these deeply unsettling accounts tonight, share your own experiences with the unknown in the comments section below, because we know many of you have your own stories that deserve to be told. Now get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we descend into the darkness that lives within the deep woods of the Cascades. Aurora had been leading hiking tours through the North Cascades for 8 years. She knew every mile of the Cascade Pass Trail, every switchback, every viewpoint where tourists stopped to catch their breath and snap photographs of the jagged peaks. The Douglas firs and western red cedars that lined the path were like old friends to her, their massive trunks and spreading branches as familiar as the rooms in her own home. She had guided families with young children, elderly couples celebrating anniversaries, and solo adventurers seeking solitude in the wilderness. In all those years, through every season and every type of weather, she had never experienced anything that shook her confidence in these mountains. That was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. It started with an email in late October, when the tourist season was winding down and the first snows were beginning to dust the higher elevations. A man named Nicholas contacted Aurora through her guiding service website. He wanted to hire her for a private trek to a remote alpine meadow near Cascade Pass, a location he had seen in old photographs from the 1970s. He offered double her usual rate and emphasized that he needed to reach this specific spot before the winter snows made it inaccessible. Something about the urgency in his message gave Aurora pause. But the money was good and she prided herself on accommodating client requests. She agreed to meet him at the Cascade River Road trailhead at dawn 3 days later. Nicholas arrived exactly on time, driving a rental car with Oregon plates. He was in his mid-40s, fit enough for the hike, but with a nervous energy that Aurora found unsettling. He kept checking over his shoulder as they prepared their packs, scanning the empty parking lot as if expecting someone else to arrive. When Aurora asked if he was waiting for additional hiking partners, he shook his head quickly and said they needed to get started immediately. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky with pale orange light as they set off up the trail, their headlamps still necessary in the dim forest. The first 2 miles passed uneventfully. Aurora maintained her usual pace, pointing out landmarks and sharing facts about the local ecosystem. But Nicholas barely responded. He walked with his head down, hands gripping his pack straps, breathing harder than he should have been at this relatively easy grade. Aurora had guided anxious hikers before, people afraid of bears or worried about their physical stamina. But this felt different. Nicholas radiated a specific kind of fear, the kind that came from knowing something rather than imagining it. At the 3-mile mark, where the trail emerged from dense forest into a more open area of subalpine meadow, Aurora noticed something that stopped her in her tracks. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds called from the branches. No wind rustled through the needles of the mountain hemlocks. No small animals scurried through the underbrush. Just their footsteps on the packed dirt trail and their breathing in the thin mountain air. In 8 years of guiding, Aurora had never experienced such absolute silence in these woods. Even in the dead of winter there were sounds. Ravens calling, branches creaking, the whisper of snow falling from overladen boughs. Nicholas noticed it too. He stopped walking and turned in a slow circle, his face pale despite the exertion of the climb. Aurora was about to suggest they take a water break when Nicholas suddenly pointed to something off the trail. A massive western hemlock stood about 30 yards to their right, its trunk easily 6 feet in diameter, old enough to have been growing when the first white settlers reached the Cascades. Carved into its bark were symbols Aurora had never seen before. Not the initials and hearts that foolish hikers sometimes carved into trees despite park regulations. These were complex geometric patterns, circles within circles, lines that curved and intersected in ways that hurt to look at for too long. The cuts were fresh enough that sap still wept from the wounds in the bark, dripping down in sticky amber tears. Aurora approached the tree slowly, her guide training overriding her unease. Vandalism in the national park was a serious matter that needed to be documented and reported. She pulled out her phone to take photographs, but the screen refused to focus properly. Every image came out blurred, the symbols indistinct no matter how many times she tried. Nicholas did not join her at the tree. He stood on the trail, staring into the forest with an expression that looked almost like recognition, as if he had expected to find exactly this. That was when Aurora saw the second tree. Another hemlock, this one about 50 yards deeper into the forest, marked with identical symbols. And beyond that, barely visible through the undergrowth, a third tree. The symbols formed a trail leading away from the maintained hiking path, deeper into the wilderness toward areas where Aurora knew there were no established routes. Only steep ravines, deadfall timber, and terrain too rough for safe travel without specialized equipment. She turned back to Nicholas and found him already walking toward the marked trees. Aurora called out for him to stop, that they needed to stay on the trail, that she was obligated to report the vandalism to park rangers before proceeding. But Nicholas did not stop. He moved with sudden purpose, as if he had been waiting for this moment, as if the marked trees were exactly what he had come to find. Aurora had a choice to make. Let him go alone into dangerous terrain or follow and try to bring him back safely. Her responsibility as a guide won out over her growing sense of wrongness. She hurried after him, pulling her radio from her belt to call the ranger station. The radio crackled with static, but no voices came through, though they were well within range of the nearest repeater tower. The symbols led them through increasingly difficult terrain. Aurora had to help Nicholas over fallen logs and guide him around clusters of devil's club, their stems thick with vicious thorns. The silence persisted, oppressive and unnatural. Aurora's heart hammered in her chest, and it was not from the exertion. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to get back to the trail, to get out of these woods. But Nicholas pushed forward with manic determination, barely pausing to catch his breath. Aurora grabbed his arm and physically stopped him, demanding to know what they were looking for, why he had really hired her, what he knew about these symbols. Nicholas finally looked at her with eyes that held a mixture of desperation and resignation. He said he had been here before, 15 years ago, with 3 friends. They had found something in these woods, something that should not exist. His friends had wanted to tell people, to bring cameras back, to prove what they had seen. Nicholas had been the only one who wanted to leave and never return. His 3 friends had come back without him a week later. None of them had ever been seen again. Their cars were found at the trailhead. Their gear was never recovered. The search and rescue operation had lasted for weeks, but turned up nothing. No trace, no clues. Just 3 people who vanished into the Cascades, as if they had never existed. Before Aurora could respond, before she could process what Nicholas had just told her, they pushed through a thick stand of young hemlocks and emerged into a clearing. The trees formed a perfect circle, their trunks equidistant from each other, growing in a formation that could not possibly be natural. The ground was bare dirt, no undergrowth, no fallen needles, nothing but smooth earth. And standing in the clearing, arranged in a circle facing inward toward the center, were 7 figures wearing hooded cloaks. They were completely motionless. No breathing. No movement of fabric in the breeze that had finally, mercifully, started to blow again. The cloaks were dark gray, homespun fabric that looked heavy and old. Aurora's first thought was that they had stumbled onto some kind of ceremony or ritual, and her second thought was to apologize and back away. But then she noticed the details that made her blood turn to ice. The figures cast no shadows, despite the morning sun slanting through the trees. The grass was not bent beneath their feet. They stood half an inch above the ground, hovering impossibly. Nicholas grabbed Aurora's arm so hard it would leave bruises. He whispered that they needed to leave immediately, right now, not back the way they came, but in any other direction. But Aurora stood frozen, unable to look away from the figures, unable to process what she was seeing. That was when the figures moved. They did not turn their heads. They did not pivot their bodies. One moment they faced inward toward the center of the circle. The next moment they faced outward, toward Aurora and Nicholas, as if they had simply existed in both positions simultaneously without the transition of movement between. The hoods were deep and dark, and Aurora instinctively knew she did not want to see what was beneath them. But the morning sun had shifted, and light fell across the face of the nearest figure. There was nothing there. Not a face hidden in shadow, but nothing at all. The hood framed an absence, a space where features should have been, but were not. A void that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Aurora's mind struggled to understand what her eyes reported. Human brains are not designed to process the sight of a person with no face, no features, just emptiness where a human should be. The dissonance caused her physical pain, a sharp spike of pressure behind her eyes that made her gasp. That gasp seemed to be a signal. The figures moved toward them, not walking but gliding, closing the distance with impossible speed. Nicholas yanked Aurora backward, and they ran. Branches tore at their faces and hands. Roots tried to trip them. The forest had become a maze of obstacles that seemed to reach for them deliberately. Behind them, Aurora could hear something following. Not footsteps, not breathing, just a presence, a displacement of air. Something massive moving through the trees. They crashed through underbrush. Aurora's training and knowledge of the terrain abandoned in pure panic flight. Nicholas fell twice, and both times Aurora hauled him up and pushed him forward. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs trembled. Ran until Aurora had no idea where they were or which direction led back to the trail. Then, as suddenly as the nightmare had started, they burst onto the maintained hiking path. The Cascade Pass trail stretched before them, solid and real and normal. The terrible silence was gone. Birds sang in the trees. A marmot whistled alarm from the rocks above. The world had returned to making sense. Aurora and Nicholas collapsed on the trail, gasping for breath. Neither spoke for several minutes. When Aurora finally had enough air to use her radio, it worked perfectly. Her call to the ranger station went through clearly. She reported their location and said they were hiking out immediately due to an emergency situation. She did not try to explain what kind of emergency. She knew how it would sound. They reached the trailhead in record time, practically jogging down the trail despite their exhaustion. Aurora drove them both to the ranger station, where she gave her report. She told them about the symbols carved in the trees, about the clearing with the figures, about the chase through the forest. The rangers listened with professional courtesy, but Aurora could see the skepticism in their eyes. They probably thought she and Nicholas had eaten mushrooms or experienced some kind of shared panic attack. But they agreed to send a team to investigate. 6 hours later, the investigation team returned. They had found no carved trees, no symbols, no clearing with trees in a perfect circle. The GPS coordinates Aurora had provided led to dense forest with no signs of human presence, no disturbance to the undergrowth, no indication anyone had been there. The rangers gently suggested that the altitude and exertion might have caused confusion, that the human mind can play tricks in stressful situations, that perhaps Aurora should take some time off from guiding. Nicholas left immediately after giving his statement. He did not say goodbye to Aurora. He got in his rental car and drove away, and she never heard from him again. She tried to find him weeks later, searching for the email address he had used to contact her, but it bounced back as invalid. The phone number he had provided was disconnected. It was as if Nicholas himself had been erased. Aurora continued to guide hikes through the Cascades. She had bills to pay and a reputation to maintain. She told herself it had been altitude sickness or dehydration or some psychological break caused by stress. She told herself this because the alternative was impossible. But she now refused to take clients off established trails, no matter how much they offered to pay. She stayed on the maintained paths, on the routes that appeared on official park maps, in the places where hundreds of other hikers walked each day. She still saw the symbols sometimes, in the patterns of bark on old trees, in the way shadows fell across stone. Her mind tried to find those shapes everywhere now, as if having seen them once had opened a door in her perception that could not be closed. And at night, when sleep took her deeper than she wanted to go, Aurora dreamed of that clearing. She dreamed of standing in the center of that circle with the 7 figures surrounding her. In her dreams, she could see what was beneath the hoods. She saw what existed in that terrible emptiness where faces should have been. She always woke before dawn from those dreams, heart racing, sheets soaked with sweat. She would make coffee and sit by her window watching the sky lighten over the mountains, grateful for another night survived. Grateful she had run when she had the chance. Grateful she had not looked longer at what stood in that clearing. Because part of her, the part that woke her screaming some nights, suspected that the figures had let them leave. That Nicholas had been brought there to see something, to be reminded of something. And she had simply been an unfortunate witness. That the Cascades held spaces where the normal rules did not apply, where things existed that should not exist, where the barriers between what was possible and what was impossible wore dangerously thin. Aurora still guides hikers through those mountains, but she does not take anyone to hidden places anymore. She stays where the maps say to stay. She walks where thousands of others have walked safely. And if clients ask why she will not accommodate special requests to visit remote locations, she simply says the terrain is too dangerous. She does not tell them the truth. That some places in these mountains do not want to be found by the kind of people who come back. That there are clearings in these woods where figures without faces wait in patient circles. That the Cascade forests hold secrets darker than old-growth shadows. Secrets that carve themselves into living wood and into human memory with equal permanence. Some nights she thinks about Nicholas and his 3 friends, who vanished 15 years ago. She wonders if they found what they were looking for in that second visit. She wonders if they are still in those woods somehow, in that clearing, standing in their own circle facing inward forever. She wonders if one day she will lead a hike and see the symbols again, marking the trees, showing the way to a place where she does not want to return but might not be able to resist. Those are the nights when Aurora does not sleep at all. She sits awake until dawn, keeping watch, making sure that if something comes down from those mountains looking for her, she will at least see it coming. The Cascades are beautiful in daylight, majestic and pure and breathtaking. But Aurora knows now what waits in the spaces between the trails. She knows what stands in the clearings where no one is meant to walk, and she will never stop knowing, never stop remembering, never stop seeing those symbols carved into her memory as deeply as they were carved into the bark of trees that no longer show any scars. Ellie was a wildlife biologist studying spotted owl populations in the old-growth forests surrounding Mount Rainier. She had spent the better part of 3 years conducting field research in some of the most remote wilderness areas in the Cascades, places where the trees were so ancient and so tall that their canopies created a permanent twilight at ground level even on the brightest days. The work required weeks of solitude, hiking miles into trackless forest to set up audio recording equipment that would capture the territorial calls of the endangered northern spotted owl. Most people would have found the isolation unbearable, but Ellie had always been comfortable alone in the wilderness. She found peace in the silence broken only by bird calls and the whisper of wind through Douglas fir needles. The solitude had never bothered her. Not until the 3rd week at her research site in February, when winter still gripped the high country and the forest was locked in cold silence. Her research protocol was straightforward, but labor-intensive. She would hike into a designated area carrying recording equipment, establish a base camp, and spend 2 weeks documenting owl activity through audio surveillance. The recorders ran continuously, capturing everything within a 1/4-mile radius. During the day, Ellie would check the equipment, download data to her laptop, and review hours of recordings for the distinctive 4-note call of the spotted owl. At night, she stayed in her tent, analyzing data and preparing field notes. She had completed this routine successfully at a dozen different sites without incident. The forest had always felt like a sanctuary, a place of scientific inquiry and natural beauty. That perception changed on her 3rd night at the new research location, a valley thick with western red cedars and hemlocks that had been growing since before European settlers reached the Pacific Northwest. Ellie had positioned her recording devices in a triangle pattern, each unit about 200 yards from her camp. The equipment was sophisticated, capable of capturing sounds too faint or too high-pitched for human ears to detect. On the evening of the 3rd day, she sat in her tent reviewing the previous night's recordings, headphones on, listening to the ambient sounds of the forest at night. Mostly it was silence punctuated by the occasional crack of a branch or the distant call of a great horned owl. Then, at exactly 2:47 in the morning, according to the timestamp, she heard something that made her fingers freeze on the keyboard. A voice, human, whispering her name. Ellie. She rewound the recording and played it again. The voice was clear, unmistakable, speaking her name slowly as if testing how the syllables felt. Ellie. She checked the timestamp again. 2:47 a.m. She had been asleep at that time, alone in her tent. 5 miles from the nearest maintained trail and at least 10 miles from where anyone else would have reason to be. She told herself it had to be some acoustic anomaly, wind through the trees creating sounds that resembled speech, the audio equivalent of seeing faces in clouds. The human brain was designed to find patterns even where none existed. But she played the recording a dozen more times, and each time it sounded more clearly like her name whispered by a human voice. Ellie barely slept that night. She kept her headlamp on and her satellite phone within reach, though she knew there was no one she could reasonably call. What would she say? That her recording equipment had captured someone whispering her name in the middle of a forest where no one else should be? It sounded absurd, even in her own mind. But as she lay awake in her sleeping bag, listening to the ordinary sounds of the night forest, she could not shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. The wilderness no longer felt neutral. It felt attentive, aware. The next day, Ellie seriously considered packing up and hiking out early. She could report equipment malfunction, weather concerns, any number of acceptable reasons to abandon a research site before completing the full 2-week observation period. But 3 years of graduate work depended on collecting sufficient data, and spotted owls were difficult subjects to study. Abandoning a site meant losing valuable research time and disappointing the professors and agencies funding her work. She decided to stay, but took precautions. She moved her tent closer to her equipment, within sight of all 3 recording stations. She kept her pepper spray and emergency whistle attached to her jacket at all times. And that night, she stayed awake, sitting outside her tent with a headlamp and her laptop, determined to witness whatever happened at 2:47 a.m. The forest at night was a different world than the forest by day. Darkness amplified every sound and created spaces where imagination could run wild. Ellie sat on a camp chair, wrapped in a heavy down jacket, her breath forming clouds in the freezing air. She watched the timer on her laptop count toward 2:47. At 2:45, she turned off her headlamp and let her eyes adjust to the darkness. The moon was nearly full, providing just enough illumination to see the silhouettes of the massive trees surrounding her camp. At exactly 2:47 a.m., she heard it with her own ears. Not through recording equipment, not filtered through headphones, but live and immediate in the cold night air. Her name whispered from somewhere in the darkness beyond her tent. Ellie. The voice came from the direction of the western recording station, about 200 yards away. Then she heard something that made every muscle in her body tense. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the undergrowth. Not the quick scurrying of a raccoon or the cautious steps of a deer. These were the measured footsteps of something walking on 2 legs, something that was in no hurry, something that knew exactly where it was going. The footsteps began to circle her campsite. Ellie grabbed her flashlight with shaking hands and aimed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating tree trunks and hanging moss, but nothing else. The footsteps continued, unaffected by the light, moving steadily from her left to her right. She swept the flashlight in an arc, trying to find the source, but saw nothing. Just trees and shadows, and the pale undergrowth of ferns and salal. Yet the footsteps were unmistakable now, close enough that she should be able to see whatever was making them. Then she saw the shadow. It moved between 2 massive cedars, visible for only a moment in the edge of her flashlight beam. Too tall to be human. 7 feet at least, maybe taller, moving with a fluid grace that seemed wrong somehow, as if the joints bent in ways that human joints should not bend. Ellie kept her flashlight trained on the spot where she had seen it, but the shadow did not reappear. The footsteps continued circling, never changing pace, never stopping. Around and around her campsite they went, maintaining a consistent distance of perhaps 50 feet. Close enough to be heard clearly, but far enough to remain hidden in the darkness beyond her flashlight's reach. For 18 minutes, Ellie sat frozen in her chair while something circled her camp. She counted the minutes on her watch, needing some concrete task to prevent her mind from spiraling into complete panic. 18 minutes of steady footsteps, occasionally punctuated by the crack of a breaking twig or the rustle of disturbed ferns. Then, as abruptly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. The forest returned to its normal nighttime quiet. Ellie sat motionless for another hour, flashlight clutched in her hand, before she finally retreated into her tent. She did not sleep. She sat with her back against her pack, satellite phone in her lap, watching the tent entrance until dawn broke and the forest returned to something that resembled normalcy. In the morning light, Ellie examined the area around her camp. If something had circled her campsite for 18 minutes, there should be evidence. Footprints, broken vegetation, some sign of passage. She found nothing. The forest floor showed no unusual disturbance, no tracks except her own. It was as if whatever had walked around her tent had left no more trace than a ghost. She should have hiked out that morning. Every rational instinct told her to pack her equipment and leave immediately. But Ellie had spent her entire adult life training to be a scientist, learning to observe, to document, to seek evidence and rational explanations. She told herself there had to be an explanation. Some kind of animal she was unfamiliar with. Acoustic tricks caused by the terrain. Stress-induced hallucinations brought on by isolation. She decided to stay one more night and document whatever happened with every piece of recording equipment she had. That day, Ellie set up additional cameras pointing at her campsite. She checked and rechecked all her equipment, making sure everything was functioning properly. She positioned her tent so she had a clear view of the western recording station where the voice had seemed to originate. She prepared her pack so she could evacuate quickly if necessary, keeping only essential items in the tent. And when night fell again, she was ready. Or so she thought. At 2:47 a.m., the whispers started again. But this time they were closer, much closer. Right outside her tent. Ellie. The voice was directly on the other side of the thin nylon fabric, close enough that she could hear the breath behind the words. Then the footsteps began again, but instead of circling at a distance, they moved around the tent itself, inches from where she sat. Ellie did not reach for her flashlight. Some deep survival instinct told her that seeing what was outside her tent would be worse than not seeing it. She sat paralyzed, listening to the footsteps circle her tent. One circuit, 2, 3. On the fourth circuit, she saw the tent fabric begin to move. Something was pushing against it from the outside, creating a bulge that traveled along the wall at about shoulder height. Not like an animal brushing against the tent, but like something running its hand along the fabric, feeling the shape of the tent, maybe feeling for the entrance. Then the zipper began to open. Ellie watched in horror as the zipper on her tent entrance slowly descended, pulled by nothing she could see. Inch by inch it opened, the sound of the metal teeth separating impossibly loud in the silence. She could see darkness through the widening gap, and she knew with absolute certainty that she did not want to see what was on the other side. She lunged forward and threw herself against the tent wall, collapsing the entire structure. Poles snapped, fabric tore. Ellie thrashed her way out of the tangle of nylon and aluminum, emerging into the night air with her heart hammering and adrenaline flooding her system. Nothing was there. She swept her flashlight across the campsite. Empty. No figure. No shadow. No sign that anything had been there at all. But when she aimed the flashlight at the ground immediately around the collapsed tent, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Footprints in the frost that had formed on the ground. Bare footprints. Human-shaped, but wrong. Too large. The toes too long. And each foot had 6 toes instead of 5. Ellie did not pack. She did not try to salvage her equipment. She grabbed her pack with her essential supplies and her satellite phone, and she ran. She ran through the dark forest with only her headlamp to light the way, stumbling over roots and crashing through undergrowth. Not caring about the noise she made or the branches that tore at her face and hands. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs trembled. And then she kept running. It took her 4 hours to cover the 5 miles to the nearest trail, and another 3 hours to reach the ranger station. She arrived just after dawn, exhausted and bleeding from dozens of small cuts, but alive. The rangers listened to her story with expressions that cycled from concern to skepticism. They sent a team to investigate, but the team found her campsite exactly as it had been before she arrived. No collapsed tent, no scattered equipment. Everything she had left behind was simply gone. The recording devices, the cameras, her tent, her research materials. All of it vanished as if it had never existed. The only things Ellie had were what she had been carrying when she ran, and the scratches on her face and arms from her panicked flight through the forest. Ellie reported the incident to her university advisors. She filed paperwork with the National Park Service. She tried to explain what had happened, but she could see in their faces that they thought she had experienced some kind of breakdown. Young researcher, alone too long in the wilderness, cracking under the pressure of isolation. They recommended she take time off. See a counselor. Consider whether field biology was the right career path for her. 3 months later, Ellie transferred to a different research project studying salmon populations in eastern Oregon. Work that involved day trips and nights spent in hotels rather than tents. Work that never required her to be alone in the forest after dark. Her professors expressed disappointment. She had shown such promise as a field researcher. But Ellie did not care about their disappointment. She had heard her name whispered in a voice that should not exist. She had felt something circle her tent in the darkness. She had seen footprints with 6 toes. She knows now that there are places in the Cascade forests where the rules of the natural world do not fully apply. Places where something else lives. Something that knows the names of people who venture too far from established trails. Something that whispers in the darkness and leaves no footprints except in frost. Something that can make recording equipment and tents and all evidence of human presence simply disappear. Ellie will never return to those forests. She avoids hiking. She flinches when she hears footsteps behind her on city streets. And sometimes, in the moment between waking and sleeping, she hears it again. Her name whispered in the darkness. Ellie. She wakes with her heart racing, telling herself it was just a dream, just a memory, nothing more. But some nights she is not so sure. Some nights she wonders if whatever was in those woods followed her out somehow, imprinted on her like a scent that cannot be washed away. She tells herself she is safe now, surrounded by civilization, far from the ancient forests of the Cascades. But deep down, in the part of her mind that still lives in that moment when the tent zipper began to open, she knows the truth. Distance does not matter. Whatever whispered her name in the darkness knows where she is. It has always known. And someday, in some quiet moment when she is alone, she might hear those footsteps again, slow and steady, circling, patient, waiting for the moment to whisper her name one more time. Adam and Sadie were professional photographers who had spent the last 5 years documenting the waterfalls of the Pacific Northwest. They had built a reputation for capturing images that magazines and travel websites paid premium rates to publish, photographs that showed familiar landscapes from unexpected angles with lighting that seemed almost supernatural. Their success came from their willingness to go where other photographers would not, to obtain permits for restricted areas, to hike off trail to locations that required technical climbing skills and a tolerance for risk. They were good at what they did, and they took pride in finding shots that no one else could replicate. In early April, they secured permits to access a restricted section of the Columbia River Gorge, an area that had been closed to the public for over 2 years following the Eagle Creek fire. The Forest Service was conducting restoration assessments, and the trails remained officially shut while crews worked to clear hazards and monitor for landslides. But Adam had connections with a ranger who owed him a favor, and they obtained special permission for a single day of photography in the burn zone. The ranger warned them that the area was dangerous, that trees weakened by fire could fall without warning, that the ground was unstable in places. Adam and Sadie signed liability waivers and promised to stay in communication via radio. They were looking for something specific, a waterfall deep in the restricted zone that few people knew existed, one that had supposedly escaped the worst of the fire damage. They started hiking before dawn, carrying cameras, tripods, and specialized lighting equipment. The trail was overgrown in places, showing the lack of regular maintenance that comes with prolonged closure. Burn scars marked many of the trees, black streaks climbing up trunks that had somehow survived the flames. But as they pushed deeper into the restricted area, the forest grew thicker and greener. They were entering a valley that the fire had mostly bypassed, a pocket of old growth surrounded by devastation. By mid-morning, they reached their destination. The waterfall was everything they had hoped for and more. Water cascaded down a basalt cliff face in 3 distinct tiers, the spray creating rainbows in the morning light. Western red cedars and hemlocks surrounded the falls, their branches heavy with moss and ferns. Mist hung in the air like silk, diffusing the sunlight into something soft and dreamlike. It was perfect. It was exactly the kind of location that would produce portfolio-defining images. Adam set up the first camera while Sadie adjusted the tripod, checking angles and framing. The sound of the falling water filled the air with white noise that was almost meditative. This was why they did what they did. These moments of being alone in the places of raw natural beauty, creating art that would allow others to see what few people ever witnessed firsthand. Adam took several test shots, checking exposure and composition on the camera's preview screen. Everything looked good. He signaled to Sadie to move to a different position so he could capture her silhouette against the falls for scale. That was when he noticed them in the frame. Behind Sadie, among the trees at the edge of the clearing, there were people, at least a dozen figures standing perfectly still, watching them. Adam lowered the camera and looked with his naked eyes. Nothing there, just trees and ferns and mist. He raised the camera again and looked at the preview screen. The figures were there, clear as day, standing among the trees. Men and women in clothing that looked old-fashioned, dark jackets and long dresses from another era. All of them facing toward Adam and Sadie. All of them completely motionless. Adam called to Sadie and showed her the camera screen. She stared at the image, then turned to look at the trees behind her. Nothing visible. They walked to where the figures appeared in the photograph. No footprints, no disturbance in the moss, no evidence that anyone had been standing there. Adam took another photo of the same area. The figures were closer now, still among the trees, but definitely nearer than they had been in the first image. Sadie pulled out her own camera and looked through the viewfinder. She went pale and lowered the camera slowly. She told Adam she could see them through the lens. Clearly, detailed enough to see their faces. Hollow eyes staring at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Expressions that were not quite right. Mouths slightly too wide, features just wrong enough to trigger a deep, instinctive revulsion. But when she lowered the camera, nothing was there. They should have left immediately. Both of them felt it. That primal warning that something was deeply wrong with this place. But they were professionals, and this was the kind of inexplicable phenomenon that could make a career if properly documented. They spent the next 20 minutes taking photographs, dozens of them, from different angles and with different equipment. Every single image showed the figures, and in every successive photo, the figures were closer. The watchers began appearing in every direction. Through the camera viewfinders, Adam and Sadie could see themselves surrounded by a crowd of silent observers. The figures stood at the edges of the clearing now, a ring of watchers dressed in clothes from a century past, all staring with those wrong faces and hollow eyes. None of them moved. They simply stood and watched with an attention that felt malevolent. Adam tried to review the photos on his camera screen, wanting to see if the images showed any detail that might explain what they were seeing. But something was wrong with the display. The figures in the photographs were moving. Not in the jerky frame-by-frame way of video, but smoothly, like looking through a window at something alive. In the images, the watchers were walking toward the center of the frame, toward where Adam and Sadie had been standing when the photos were taken, converging slowly but inevitably. Sadie grabbed Adam's arm and pointed to her own camera. The same thing was happening. The figures in her viewfinder were moving now, not just standing, walking toward them with slow, deliberate steps. When Sadie pointed her camera at the trees, she could see the watchers advancing across the clearing, their feet not quite touching the ground, gliding more than walking, moving toward where she and Adam stood. They made the decision to leave without needing to discuss it. Some instinct older than language told them both that they were in immediate danger, that whatever they were seeing through their cameras was not just some optical phenomenon or equipment malfunction. It was something real, something threatening, something that existed in a layer of reality that human eyes could not normally perceive. They grabbed what gear they could carry quickly and ran, leaving thousands of dollars of equipment behind. The run back to the trailhead took half the time the hike in had taken. They crashed through undergrowth and scrambled over fallen logs, not caring about the noise or the damage to their clothes. Behind them, always just out of sight but definitely present, they heard sounds. Not footsteps exactly, but a displacement of air, a sense of movement, a presence that matched their pace and seemed to herd them in a specific direction. When they finally burst onto the main trail, the presence vanished. The forest returned to its normal sounds. Birds called, a squirrel chattered, water rushed in a nearby creek. The world made sense again. Adam and Sadie collapsed on the trail, gasping for breath, checking behind them for pursuit that never materialized. The ranger who had granted them access was waiting at the trailhead when they emerged 2 hours later. He took one look at their faces and asked what had happened. Adam tried to explain, but the words sounded absurd, spoken aloud in the bright afternoon sunlight. The ranger listened without expression, then asked if they wanted to file a formal report. They declined. What would they say? That they had seen ghosts through their camera viewfinders? That figures from a century ago had chased them through the forest? 3 days later, the ranger called Adam. A recovery team had gone into the restricted area to retrieve the equipment they had left behind. Everything was exactly where they had dropped it. The cameras, the tripods, the lighting gear, all undisturbed. But when they checked the memory cards, every photograph was blank. Pure white. No images at all. Not just the photos with the figures, but every single shot they had taken that day. Complete data corruption on multiple cards from different cameras. The ranger said technical failure happened sometimes in the field, but Adam could hear the doubt in his voice. Adam and Sadie never went back to the Columbia River Gorge. They sold their photography equipment 2 months later and went their separate ways. Adam moved to California and started working in real estate photography. Safe indoor work with artificial lighting and no surprises. Sadie took a job teaching graphic design at a community college. Neither of them has picked up a camera for personal work since that day. Sometimes Adam dreams about the watchers. He sees them standing in crowds at the edges of rooms, staring at him with those hollow eyes and wrong faces. In his dreams, they are closer each time, converging slowly but steadily. He wakes before they reach him, but he knows that eventually, in some dream, they will close the distance completely. And he wonders what will happen then. Sadie tells people she lost interest in photography, that she burned out on the freelance lifestyle and wanted something more stable. She does not tell them the truth, that she sees the watchers sometimes in her peripheral vision, standing at the edges of crowds, in reflections in store windows, in the shadows of parking garages, always watching, always still, always wearing clothes from another time. They never talked to each other about what happened. The experience severed their professional partnership and their friendship. Some things cannot be shared without breaking something fundamental between people. Some experiences isolate rather than bond. The waterfall in the restricted area still exists, still cascades down the basalt cliff in 3 beautiful tiers. The Forest Service eventually reopened some of the trails in that section of the gorge. Hikers pass within a mile of that spot regularly now. Some of them probably find the clearing and take photographs of the falls with their phones and digital cameras. Adam wonders sometimes if any of them see figures in their images. If anyone else has looked through a lens and seen the watchers standing among the trees. If anyone else has felt that terrible attention focused on them. But mostly he tries not to think about it at all. He lives in a world of bright rooms and artificial light now, a world where cameras capture exactly what the eye can see and nothing more. A world where the past stays safely in the past and the dead remain dead. He needs to believe that world is the only real one. Because the alternative, that there are layers of reality bleeding through in certain places, in certain conditions, visible only through the specific wavelengths captured by camera lenses, is too terrible to accept. The Cascades are full of beautiful places, places where light and water and stone create scenes of breathtaking beauty. But some of those places have watchers, and the watchers remember, and they wait, and they appear in photographs that should show nothing but trees and mist and falling water. And sometimes, if you are unlucky enough to see them, they begin to move. Gavin was an experienced backcountry ranger maintaining remote trails in the North Cascades. He had worked these mountains for 12 years, longer than anyone else in his district. He knew the trail system better than the maps did, better than the GPS coordinates suggested. Every junction, every landmark, every mile marker was burned into his memory through countless patrols in all seasons and all weather conditions. He could navigate the backcountry in fog, in darkness, in whiteout snow conditions. He prided himself on never getting lost, on being the ranger other rangers called when they needed someone to find lost hikers or verify confusing trail reports. His knowledge of these mountains was encyclopedic and earned through thousands of miles of walking. That expertise made what happened to him even more impossible to explain. It started with a series of reports from hikers about a trail that had become confusing. 3 separate groups over the course of 2 weeks had contacted the ranger station to report disorientation on the Fir Creek Trail, a simple out-and-back route that led 6 miles to an alpine lake. The trail was rated easy to moderate, well-marked and heavily trafficked during the summer season. It was not the kind of trail where experienced hikers got lost. Yet all 3 groups reported the same thing. They had reached a junction that should not exist, became disoriented trying to navigate it, and eventually turned back without reaching the lake. One group had wandered for 3 hours trying to find their way forward before giving up. Gavin dismissed it as inexperienced hikers misreading their maps. People got confused in the wilderness more often than they wanted to admit, and their egos invented excuses. A junction that should not exist was easier to report than admitting they had simply gotten turned around. Gavin volunteered to inspect the trail personally, mostly to put the matter to rest. He packed light, planning on a quick day hike to the lake and back. He brought GPS, compass, detailed trail maps, and his radio. He had hiked this particular trail at least 24 times over the years. He expected to find nothing unusual. The morning was clear and cool, perfect hiking weather. Gavin made good time on the familiar trail, noting conditions and checking for hazards. Everything was normal. The trail was well maintained, the markers were all present, the terrain matched his memory exactly. At 2 miles in, he should have been approaching a small creek crossing. At 4 miles, a distinctive rock formation. At 6 miles, the lake. Simple, straightforward, impossible to get wrong. But at the 2-mile mark, Gavin encountered something that stopped him cold. A trail junction, 2 paths diverging into the forest, both looking equally used, both appearing legitimate. His map showed no junction for another 5 miles. The GPS coordinates confirmed he was exactly where he thought he was. But the GPS showed no trail junction at this location. The trail database had been updated just 3 months ago. There should be no junction here. Gavin examined both paths carefully. They looked identical. Same width, same level of maintenance, same type of trail markers. One path led roughly northeast, which was the correct direction to the lake. The other led more directly north. Based on the map, he should continue on the trail that bore northeast. He marked the junction coordinates on his GPS and continued forward. 30 minutes later, he arrived at a junction. The same junction. He was certain of it. The same 2 paths, the same trail markers, the exact same configuration. But that was impossible. He had been walking steadily uphill on a trail that should lead deeper into the wilderness. There was no loop that would bring him back to the same spot. Gavin checked his GPS. The coordinates showed he had traveled nearly a mile from the junction, but he was standing in what appeared to be the identical location. He tried again, this time taking the more northerly path. He walked for 40 minutes, keeping careful track of landmarks. The trail climbed steadily through old-growth forest, passing massive western hemlocks and Douglas firs. Nothing about the terrain suggested he was walking in a circle. Yet after 40 minutes, he emerged at the junction again. The same junction, the same 2 paths diverging into the forest. Gavin sat down and forced himself to think rationally. Disorientation was a known phenomenon. Without clear visual cues, even experienced navigators could become confused. But he had a compass. He had GPS. He had been walking in a straight line on a maintained trail. There was no rational explanation for returning to the same point 3 times in a row. The forest around him was starting to look different. The trees seemed taller than they should be, their bark darker and more deeply furrowed. The light filtering through the canopy had taken on a strange quality. Too green, too thick, as if he were underwater. The air felt heavy and still. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered. The silence was profound and unnatural. Gavin tried to use his radio. Static. The GPS had stopped working entirely, the screen frozen on coordinates that no longer updated. His compass spun slowly, unable to settle on north. Every piece of technology he carried had ceased to function properly. He was alone in a forest that no longer followed the rules he understood. He tried a fourth time, taking the northeast path but marking trees with his knife as he went, cutting distinctive blazes into the bark so he would know if he was actually returning to places he had already been. He walked for an hour this time, his marked trees appearing behind him at regular intervals, proof he was making forward progress. The trail climbed steadily. The vegetation changed appropriately for increasing elevation. Everything suggested he was moving deeper into the wilderness. Then he saw his first marked tree ahead of him, then the second, then the third. The trail had somehow looped back on itself, despite climbing continuously upward. Gavin stood staring at his own knife marks on a tree, trying to comprehend what was happening. The laws of physical space were not working correctly. The trail was folding back on itself in ways that defied geometry. That was when he saw her. A woman standing on the trail ahead, about 50 yards distant. She wore a ranger uniform, but the style was wrong. The cut of the jacket was dated. The patches were different designs. The whole uniform looked like something from the 1970s or 1980s. She stood perfectly still, facing him, smiling. Even from 50 yards away, Gavin could see there was something wrong with her eyes. They were completely black. No whites, no irises. Just solid black from edge to edge like the eyes of a shark. The woman raised her hand and beckoned him forward. "Come with me," the gesture said. "I will show you the way." But every instinct Gavin possessed screamed at him to run. The woman was not human. The smile was not friendly. The black eyes held nothing but malevolence. She was something wearing the shape of a ranger, using a familiar form to lure him deeper into whatever trap this trail had become. Gavin turned and ran in the opposite direction. He crashed through underbrush, abandoning the trail entirely, no longer caring about direction or landmarks. He just needed to get away from the junction, away from the woman with black eyes, away from the trail that looped endlessly back on itself. Branches tore at his face and pack. Roots tried to trip him. He fell twice, scrambled up, kept running. He ran for what felt like hours but might have been minutes. Time had become as unreliable as space in this forest. Finally, exhausted, his lungs burning, Gavin collapsed against a massive cedar and forced himself to stop. He needed to think. Panic would kill him faster than anything else out here. That was when he heard the sound of a vehicle. A car engine close by. Gavin pushed through a final stand of trees and stumbled onto a highway. The pavement was solid and real beneath his boots. A logging truck roared past, its driver giving him a curious look. Gavin stood on the shoulder of the road, trying to orient himself. According to the highway marker, he was on State Route 20 miles from where he had started hiking. 20 miles. He had covered terrain that should have taken 2 days to traverse. He had crossed mountain ridges and valleys that lay between his starting point and this highway. Yet only a few hours had passed since he left the trailhead. His GPS, when it finally started working again, confirmed the impossible. He was 20 miles from his starting point, but the recorded track showed he had only traveled 6 miles. Gavin called for pickup and waited by the roadside. When his supervisor arrived, Gavin tried to explain what had happened. The junction that should not exist, the trail that looped impossibly, the woman in the old-style ranger uniform with black eyes. He could hear how it sounded, like a breakdown, like altitude sickness or dehydration or psychological collapse. His supervisor was sympathetic but concerned. He suggested Gavin take some time off, see a doctor, get checked for Lyme disease or other conditions that might cause confusion and disorientation. Gavin agreed because arguing would make him sound worse. But he knew what he had experienced was real. A week later, a team went to investigate his claims. They hiked the Fur Creek Trail from start to finish without incident. No mysterious junctions, no looping trail, no woman in a vintage ranger uniform. The trail was exactly as the map showed it should be. 6 miles of straightforward hiking to a beautiful alpine lake. The team completed the hike in both directions without any problems. Their report suggested that Gavin had experienced a medical episode in the field and recommended he undergo a full neurological evaluation before returning to backcountry duty. Gavin took administrative leave. He spent 2 weeks trying to convince himself it had been some kind of hallucination. But the GPS track was real data, showing him traveling impossible distances. The cuts on his face from running through underbrush were real injuries. The coordinates where his GPS had frozen were real numbers that he could verify. Something had happened on that trail that defied rational explanation. 3 weeks after his experience, Gavin submitted his resignation. He was 38 years old, in excellent physical condition, with 12 years of service and a spotless record. He could have worked another 25 years, could have retired with a full pension. Instead, he walked away. His supervisor tried to talk him out of it, but Gavin was adamant. He was done with the North Cascades, done with backcountry ranging, done with trails that should not exist and women with black eyes who wore the uniforms of rangers from decades past. Gavin moved to Montana. He works now for the Bureau of Land Management, managing grasslands and sage prairie where visibility extends for miles in every direction. Open country where trails go exactly where maps say they go, where GPS always works, where space follows the normal rules of geometry. He tells people he wanted a change of scenery, that 12 years in the Cascades was enough. He does not tell them the truth. At night sometimes, Gavin dreams about that junction, about standing at the fork in the trail, trying to decide which path to take, knowing that both paths lead back to the same impossible point. In his dreams, the woman with black eyes is always there, standing at the end of one path, beckoning him forward with that terrible smile. He always wakes before he has to decide whether to follow her. He wonders sometimes if other rangers have found that junction, if the trail still loops back on itself in ways that defy physics, if the woman still waits there in her vintage uniform, luring people deeper into a forest where the normal laws of reality do not apply. He wonders if anyone else has been brought 20 miles across impossible terrain in the space of a few hours. If anyone else has experienced the North Cascades as a place where space folds in on itself like origami. But mostly he tries not to think about it. He stays in his prairies and grasslands where the horizon is visible and trails are straight lines across comprehensible space. He tells himself he is satisfied with this new life, this safe life, this life where the worst thing that can happen is encountering a rattlesnake or getting caught in a lightning storm. Dangers he understands, dangers that follow predictable rules. Because the alternative is admitting that there are places in the mountains where the fabric of reality wears thin, where trails can exist in multiple configurations simultaneously, where something that looks human can stand and smile and beckon with eyes like holes into the void. where the wilderness is not just dangerous in the way that cliffs and weather are dangerous, but dangerous in ways that have no name and no rational explanation. The North Cascades are still there, still drawing hikers and backpackers who seek beauty and solitude in the wilderness. The trails still wind through ancient forests and climb to alpine lakes. And somewhere in those mountains, a junction exists that should not exist. A trail that loops back on itself in defiance of geometry. A woman in a ranger uniform from another era, waiting patiently with her black eyes and her welcoming smile. Waiting for the next person who wanders too far from the mapped routes. Waiting to show them the way deeper into a forest, where space does not work correctly and time becomes fluid and malleable. Waiting to guide them to places where lost rangers go and never return from. Gavin knows she is still there. Still waiting, still smiling. And he knows he will never return to find out where that smile might lead. Lucy and Connor were wilderness rangers, assigned to winterize a remote cabin before the first snows of the season arrived. The cabin sat 40 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a 2-day hike through some of the most rugged terrain in the Cascades. It had been built in the 1960s as an emergency shelter for firefighters battling backcountry blazes, constructed from rough-hewn logs and positioned in a small clearing surrounded by old-growth forest. The structure was rarely used anymore. Modern firefighting relied on helicopters and mobile camps. But the Forest Service maintained it as a historic site and occasional emergency shelter for lost or injured hikers. The winterization process involved checking the structure for damage, sealing gaps against weather, removing anything that might attract animals, and ensuring the door and windows were secure. It was straightforward work that typically took a day to complete. Lucy and Connor arrived at the cabin just as dusk was settling over the forest. They had pushed hard on the second day of hiking, wanting to reach the cabin with enough daylight to unload their packs and assess the initial work. The clearing was overgrown with ferns and salal. The cabin itself looked weathered but structurally sound, its log walls dark with age and moss. They checked the perimeter first, looking for signs of animal damage or structural weakening. Everything appeared intact. The door was still locked, the windows were unbroken, the roof showed no major damage. They would be able to complete the work in a day as planned and hike out the following morning. After securing the cabin and checking for immediate hazards, they prepared a simple dinner on their camp stove and settled in for the night. The cabin had bunks with old foam mattresses, a wood stove that still worked, and a small table with 2 chairs. It was Spartan but comfortable enough for experienced backcountry workers. They discussed their work plan for the next day, checked their equipment, and prepared for sleep. Lucy took the lower bunk, Connor the upper. The forest outside was quiet, except for the occasional call of an owl and the whisper of wind through the trees. Just after midnight, Lucy woke to a sound that made her instantly alert. Scratching, loud and deliberate, coming from beneath the floorboards. Something large was moving under the cabin, dragging against the wood with enough force to make the sound clearly audible. Lucy lay still, listening. The scratching moved in a pattern, back and forth, as if whatever was beneath them was pacing or systematically exploring the underside of the floor. She whispered Connor's name. He was already awake, she could tell by his breathing, also listening to the sounds below. Connor climbed down from his bunk quietly and grabbed his flashlight. They had both dealt with animals in backcountry cabins before, usually mice or pack rats, occasionally raccoons or even porcupines. Whatever was under, the cabin sounded larger than any of those, but it could be a bear investigating the structure. Black bears sometimes denned under buildings if they found a suitable space. Connor eased open the cabin door and stepped outside, Lucy following with her own flashlight. They circled the cabin, sweeping their lights across the foundation and the crawlspace entrance. The crawlspace opening was still sealed shut, undisturbed. The metal screen that covered the entrance was bolted in place, showing no signs of being forced or damaged. Yet, the scratching continued, clearly audible even outside the cabin. Connor and Lucy exchanged looks. If the crawlspace entrance was secure, how had something gotten underneath? There were no other openings large enough for anything bigger than a mouse to enter. They returned to the cabin, but neither could sleep. The scratching continued sporadically throughout the night, sometimes stopping for an hour, then resuming with renewed intensity. Sometimes it sounded like claws on wood. Sometimes it sounded almost like fingers scraping against the boards. The distinction made Lucy deeply uncomfortable. When dawn finally arrived, she and Connor wasted no time getting to work. They decided to open the crawlspace entrance and investigate properly. Whatever was under there needed to be dealt with before they could complete their winterization work. The crawlspace entrance was on the north side of the cabin, a 2-foot square opening covered by a heavy metal screen bolted to the foundation. Connor removed the bolts with a wrench from their toolkit and pulled the screen away. The opening revealed darkness and the smell of damp earth. Connor lay flat on his stomach and aimed his flashlight into the crawlspace. The beam illuminated a shallow space, barely 2 feet high, filled with rocks and dirt and decades of accumulated debris. He crawled forward, pulling himself into the cramped darkness on his elbows. Lucy crouched outside the entrance, keeping watch and holding a second flashlight ready. Connor's voice echoed from inside the crawlspace. He reported seeing nothing unusual at first, just dirt and rocks in the underside of the floorboards. Then his voice changed. He had found the scratches, deep gouges in the underside of the wood, fresh enough that splinters still hung from the cuts. The marks were extensive, covering large sections of the floor above where they had been sleeping. Something had been down there recently, scratching at the boards with considerable force. But the crawlspace was too shallow for anything large. Connor was having to drag himself forward on his belly, barely able to turn his head. There was no room for a bear or even a large raccoon to maneuver. Yet the scratches suggested something much bigger than a mouse had made them. He worked his way back to the entrance and emerged covered in dirt, his face troubled. He told Lucy what he had found, but could not explain it. The scratches were there. The space was too small. The facts did not reconcile. They discussed leaving immediately, abandoning the winterization work and hiking out that morning. But they were professionals with a job to complete, and nothing had actually threatened them. Strange scratching noises were not sufficient reason to leave work unfinished and waste a 40-mile hike. They decided to continue working, but planned to hike out that afternoon rather than spending another night. They could complete most of the essential winterization tasks in a few hours if they worked efficiently. The day passed without incident. They sealed gaps in the walls, cleared the chimney, removed food items that mice might get into, and secured the windows. The work was routine and helped normalize the situation. By late afternoon, they were nearly finished. Lucy was sweeping the floor while Connor checked the door latches one final time. That was when Lucy noticed something that made her stop sweeping. Between the floorboards, in the gaps where light from below might filter through, she saw movement. She knelt down and aimed her flashlight at the gap between two boards. An eye stared back at her, a human eye, bloodshot and wide, staring directly up at her through the crack in the floor, blinking. Lucy screamed and stumbled backward. Connor spun around, demanding to know what was wrong. Lucy pointed at the floor, at the gap between the boards. Connor grabbed his flashlight and looked. Nothing there now, just darkness between the boards. But Lucy had seen it clearly. An eye, human, staring at her from the crawl space that was too shallow for anything human-sized to fit. They made a decision in seconds. Grab the essential gear and leave immediately. They did not discuss it or debate it. They both knew they needed to get out of the cabin right then. They shoved critical items into their packs, left the rest, and exited the cabin at a near run. Lucy was shaking so hard she could barely fasten her pack straps. Connor's face was pale and grim. They started hiking without looking back, pushing themselves hard despite the rough terrain. They hiked through the night, using headlamps and determination to cover ground that should have taken 2 days. They did not stop to rest. They barely spoke. When they finally reached the trailhead at dawn, exhausted and filthy, they called their supervisor immediately. Lucy told him they had encountered a dangerous situation at the cabin and had evacuated. She did not explain what kind of danger. She knew how it would sound. Their supervisor sent another team to investigate. The team found the cabin exactly as Lucy and Connor had left it. Work partially completed, some gear still inside. They checked the crawl space thoroughly. It was empty. The scratches on the underside of the floorboards were there, deep and fresh, just as Connor had described. But the space was clearly too shallow for anything large to fit. The team completed the winterization work and hiked out, without incident. Their report noted the unexplained scratches, but attributed them to an animal, possibly made over an extended period by something small. Lucy requested a transfer to a desk position within 2 weeks. She told her supervisor she was dealing with a family situation that required her to be closer to civilization. Connor quit the Forest Service entirely 3 months later. He moved to Seattle and took a job with a software company about as far from wilderness work as he could get. They did not stay in touch. The experience had damaged something between them, created a shared knowledge that neither wanted to revisit. The Forest Service sealed the crawlspace entrance with concrete later that year. No official reason was given for the modification. The cabin itself was marked for demolition the following spring. Budget constraints and low usage were cited as justification. No one mentioned the scratches or the rangers who had evacuated in the middle of their assignment. The cabin was torn down in May, the logs hauled out by helicopter, the clearing left to grow over with brush and ferns. Lucy still works for the Forest Service, but she will never accept a backcountry assignment again. She processes permits and answers phones and helps plan trail maintenance schedules from a comfortable office with windows that look out on a parking lot. Sometimes, when she is working late and the office is quiet, she thinks about that eye staring up at her through the floorboards. She wonders what it belonged to, how it could have fit in a space too shallow for anything human-sized. Whether it is still in those mountains somewhere, crawling through spaces too small for its body, scratching at the underside of floors where people sleep. Connor does not talk about his time as a ranger. His co-workers at the tech company know he used to work for the Forest Service. But he deflects questions about why he left. He tells them he wanted better pay and more stability. He does not tell them about crawling through a space barely 2 feet high and finding scratches that should not exist. About hearing something moving beneath him all night, pacing and scratching. About the look on Lucy's face when she saw something staring at her from between the floorboards. Sometimes he has nightmares about tight spaces, about crawling through darkness too cramped to turn around in. His face inches from the dirt, unable to move backward or forward. In these dreams, he always feels something behind him, something breathing on his ankles, something with fingers that scrape against wood. He wakes sweating and gasping, grateful for his apartment with its concrete foundation and no crawl space. no dark hollow beneath where things might move, unseen. The cabin is gone now. The clearing where it stood is unmarked on current maps, already fading back into forest. But the mountains remember. The ancient trees around that clearing know what moved beneath that cabin floor. They know what scratches at the underside of human structures in the deep wilderness. They know what has eyes that can see through cracks and bodies that can fit in spaces that should be impossible. Lucy and Connor know too. They carry that knowledge with them, a weight that never lessens no matter how much distance they put between themselves and that remote clearing. They know there are things in the Cascade wilderness that defy rational explanation. Things that crawl where they should not fit. Things that watch from beneath with human eyes. Things that scratch messages in wood with appendages that might be claws or might be fingers. The Forest Service does not talk about why that cabin was demolished. The official records cite age and disuse. But the rangers who work the backcountry, the ones who spend weeks alone maintaining remote trails and checking on emergency shelters, they tell stories around their campfires. Stories about cabins where the floorboards creak with weight that should not be there. About scratching sounds that come from sealed spaces. About eyes that peer through gaps from darkness that should be empty. And when new rangers are assigned to check remote cabins, the veteran rangers sometimes take them aside first. They tell them to trust their instincts. They tell them that if something feels wrong, if sounds do not make sense, if eyes appear where eyes should not be, it is better to leave the work unfinished and hike out. Some places in the mountains do not want human presence. Some structures sit on ground where the boundaries between what is possible and what is impossible wear dangerously thin. Lucy and Connor learned that lesson. They learned it staring at scratches in wood and eyes in darkness. They learned it hiking 40 miles through the night because staying was unthinkable. They learned it in a way that changed them permanently, that divided their lives into before and after. Before they saw what was beneath that cabin floor. After they knew what watches from the crawl spaces of the world. The mountains do not care what people believe or understand. The wilderness keeps its secrets. And beneath the forest floor, in spaces too shallow for bodies but somehow occupied nonetheless, something continues to wait. Something that scratches. Something that watches. Something that knows when people sleep above it, separated by only a few inches of wood. Something patient and persistent and impossible. Something that the Cascades have held for longer than humans have walked these mountains. Something that will remain long after the last cabin rots and falls and returns to the earth. Isla worked as a timber surveyor, spending days alone in the forest, marking trees for logging operations. She had grown up in the Cascade foothills, the daughter of a logger and a forest ranger. And she knew the woods as intimately as most people knew their own neighborhoods. The work suited her temperament perfectly. She preferred trees to people, solitude to crowds, and the straightforward logic of measuring diameter at breast height and assessing timber quality. Weather was the only real danger she worried about. Storms could down trees without warning, lightning could strike during exposed ridgeline work, and heavy snow could trap a surveyor miles from shelter. But Isla knew how to read the sky, how to recognize the signs of changing weather, and how to retreat before conditions became life-threatening. She had been doing this work for 6 years without serious incident. That record ended on a gray February afternoon when fog rolled in faster than she had ever seen in her life. Isla was working in a mixed forest of Douglas fir and western hemlock, marking trees in a tract scheduled for selective logging the following spring. The morning had been overcast but stable, with no weather advisories and no indication of incoming systems. By early afternoon, she had marked 24 trees and was moving steadily through her survey grid. Then she noticed the light changing. The diffuse gray daylight was dimming rapidly, taking on a strange quality that made her check her watch. Only 2 in the afternoon, hours of daylight remaining. But the forest was darkening as if sunset approached. The fog came from the west, moving through the trees like something alive. Within 5 minutes, visibility dropped from hundreds of yards to less than 50 feet. Within 10 minutes, Isla could barely see 20 feet in any direction. The fog was dense and white, thicker than any natural fog she had experienced. It moved against the wind, swirling in patterns that defied meteorology. Isla marked her current position on her GPS and started back toward her truck, following the coordinates carefully. She had been in fog before, had navigated through limited visibility dozens of times. This should not have been difficult. But the fog seemed to have presence. It did not just obscure vision, it pressed against her like something physical, something with weight and intention. The temperature dropped sharply, her breath forming clouds that merged with the surrounding whiteness. The sounds of the forest were muffled and distorted. Her footsteps seemed too loud, echoing strangely. Everything felt wrong in ways she could not articulate. Then Isla saw movement in the fog. Shapes, human-sized, walking parallel to her path, keeping pace with her movement through the trees. She stopped walking. The shapes stopped. She called out, asking if anyone was there, if anyone needed help. No answer. Just the shapes at the edge of visibility, barely distinguishable from the fog itself, but definitely present, definitely watching. Ayla walked faster. The shapes matched her speed. She could see 3 of them clearly now, moving through the trees to her right. Then she noticed more on her left. At least 4 shapes, maybe more, all maintaining the same distance from her, all moving when she moved, stopping when she stopped. They never came closer, but they never fell behind either. They paced her exactly, as if connected by invisible threads. Her GPS showed she was heading the correct direction toward her truck, half a mile. She could cover that distance in 10 minutes, even in fog. But the shapes continued to follow, and Isla felt her unease growing into genuine fear. There was something predatory about the way they moved, something deliberate about maintaining that precise distance. They were hurting her, she realized, keeping her moving in a specific direction. Isla changed course abruptly, turning 90 degrees to her left, away from the truck, testing her theory. The shapes on her left moved to block her. She could see them more clearly now, tall figures wrapped in fog, never quite solid enough to see details, but definitely present. She turned right. The shapes on that side converged slightly, narrowing her path. She was being channeled. Whatever these things were, they were directing her movement. Then she heard the voices, her mother calling her name. But her mother lived in Portland, 200 miles away. The voice came from ahead of her in the fog, clear and familiar. "Isla, sweetie, come here. I need to show you something." Then her brother's voice, from a different direction. "Isla, over here. You have to see this." Her childhood friend who had died in a car accident 7 years ago. "Isla, I have been looking for you. Come find me." The voices overlapped, echoing impossibly through the fog, calling her from different directions. All familiar, all people she knew or had known. All wrong. The tone was right, the inflection was right. But something underneath was fundamentally incorrect. Like recordings played by something that did not understand human emotion, mimicking the sounds without comprehending the meaning. Isla stopped listening to the GPS. She ran, straight ahead, no longer caring about direction or coordinates. just needing to move, needing to escape the shapes and the voices and the fog that pressed against her like water. Branches tore at her face. She stumbled over roots she could not see. The fog grew thicker, turning from white to gray, reducing visibility to less than 10 feet. The voices followed, always just ahead, always calling her name, always promising to show her something wonderful if she would just come a little farther. The shapes surrounded her now, dozens of them, moving through the fog on all sides. Isla could hear them even if she could not see them clearly. The displacement of air as they glided between trees, the whisper of something that might have been fabric or might have been something else entirely. Her hand hit metal. Isla gasped and grabbed onto it, her truck door handle solid and real under her fingers. She yanked the door open and threw herself inside, slamming it behind her and locking it immediately. She started the engine with shaking hands, not caring if it was safe to drive, just needing to move, needing to get away from the fog and what it contained. The fog pressed against the windows, thick as cream, completely obscuring visibility. Isla put the truck in drive and accelerated blindly down the logging road, trusting memory and instinct to keep her wheels on the track. She heard impacts against the truck, soft thuds that made the vehicle shudder. She did not slow down. She drove faster. 3 miles down the logging road, she burst out of the fog bank into clear afternoon sunlight. The transition was instantaneous, like driving through a wall. 1 second she was surrounded by impenetrable whiteness. The next she was in bright daylight with blue sky above and clear visibility for miles. Isla pulled over and sat shaking, trying to process what had just happened. After several minutes, she got out to inspect the truck. The entire vehicle was covered in handprints, small handprints, children's handprints, hundreds of them smeared across the hood, the doors, the windows. But the handprints were on the inside of the windows, not the outside. Small fingers had pressed against the glass from within the truck cab, leaving prints in condensation that should not exist. Isla stared at the prints, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes showed. She had been alone in the truck, completely alone. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Something had been inside the vehicle with her. Something small enough to leave child-sized handprints. Something that had pressed against the windows from the inside while she drove blindly through the fog. She called her supervisor and reported a dangerous weather situation in the survey area. She did not mention the shapes or the voices or the handprints. She said fog had created unsafe working conditions and she was returning to base. Her supervisor approved without question. Fog was a legitimate safety concern. Isla never returned to that survey area. She submitted her incomplete data and requested reassignment to a different tract. Her supervisor noticed her hands were shaking when she turned in her report, but did not comment on it. Timber surveyors encountered dangerous conditions regularly. Bears, falling trees, cliff edges hidden by underbrush. It was understood that sometimes you had to retreat from work sites. 3 weeks later, another surveyor was assigned to complete Isla's abandoned survey. He reported normal conditions, clear weather, no fog, no difficulties. He completed the work in 2 days, without incident. His report made no mention of anything unusual. Isla works different areas now, staying closer to main roads, avoiding the deeper forest tracks where fog can roll in without warning. She checks weather forecasts obsessively before going into the field and refuses assignments on days when fog is predicted. Her co-workers think she has developed an anxiety disorder, an occupational hazard for people who work alone in isolated areas for extended periods. They do not know about the voices or the shapes or the handprints. Sometimes Isla drives past the turnoff to that logging road. She never takes it. But she looks at the forest there, at the dark trees that press close to the road, and she wonders if the fog is still there in the deep woods, if the shapes still wait among the trees, if the voices still call out names in familiar tones, luring people deeper into whiteness that moves with purpose and intention. She wonders about the handprints, children's hands, pressing from the inside. She wonders whose children they were, if they were ever children at all, or if something in that fog simply chose that form because humans respond to the appearance of children, because we are wired to protect small, vulnerable things, because a child's voice calling for help is almost impossible to ignore. The Cascades hold many dangers. Cliffs and crevasses, weather that can kill, animals that can maim. But the most dangerous things in those mountains are the ones that cannot be explained, the ones that hide in fog banks and call out in voices you recognize, the ones that press their hands against glass from the wrong side and leave proof that should not exist. Isla knows those dangers now. She carries that knowledge like a weight, and she will never venture into deep fog again, no matter how much money is offered, no matter how routine the assignment seems. Because she knows what waits in the whiteness. She has heard it calling her name. She has seen its shapes moving at the edge of perception. She has felt its presence pressing against her like pressure underwater. And she has seen the proof of its impossible nature printed in condensation on the inside of her truck windows. Some knowledge cannot be unlearned. Some experiences change a person forever. Isla was changed that February afternoon. She is more careful now, more fearful, more aware that the forest holds things that should not exist but do. And when fog rolls through the valleys of the Cascades, when it moves against the wind and swirls with unnatural patterns, Isla stays indoors. She stays safe. She stays away from the trees where shapes walk and voices call and small hands press against barriers that should keep them out, but somehow never do. Henry and Amelia were celebrating their 5th anniversary with a 4-day backpacking trip through the Central Cascades. They were experienced hikers who had completed dozens of backcountry treks together, comfortable with the challenges of wilderness travel and confident in their ability to handle whatever conditions they encountered. This trip was meant to be a celebration, a return to the activity that had brought them together when they met on a group hiking trip 5 years earlier. They had chosen a popular trail that would take them through subalpine meadows and past several pristine mountain lakes. Everything had been planned carefully. They had permits, appropriate gear, detailed maps, and a solid itinerary. Everything went perfectly for the first 2 days. The weather was ideal for late summer, warm days and cool nights, with clear skies that turned the alpine lakes into mirrors reflecting the surrounding peaks. They saw other hikers on the trail, exchanged pleasantries at designated campsites, and fell into the comfortable rhythm of backcountry travel. They reached their second night campsite near a subalpine lake surrounded by mountain hemlocks, the water so clear they could see fish moving in the depths. As they cooked dinner on their camp stove, Amelia noticed a man standing at the far edge of the lake, perhaps 200 yards away. He was perfectly still, facing their direction. Too far to see clearly in the fading evening light, just a silhouette against the trees. Amelia pointed him out to Henry. They both watched for a moment, waiting to see if the man would move or call out. He did nothing, just stood there, motionless. Henry waved, a friendly greeting to a fellow backpacker. The man did not respond, did not wave back, did not move at all. After a few minutes, Henry and Amelia returned to their meal preparation, occasionally glancing toward the figure. When they looked again, 10 minutes later, He was gone. They discussed it briefly. Probably another hiker scouting for a campsite, deciding this lake was too crowded with them already there, moving on to find a more private location. Nothing unusual about that. Backcountry etiquette encouraged spacing out camping groups to maintain the wilderness experience. They finished dinner, hung their food in a bear bag, and settled into their tent for the night. The lake was silent except for the occasional splash of a jumping fish and the whisper of wind through the hemlocks. The next morning dawned clear and beautiful. They packed camp efficiently, having developed their system over years of hiking together. The trail climbed steeply from the lake, switchbacking up a ridge that would offer spectacular views of the surrounding peaks. About an hour into their hike, Amelia stopped abruptly. She pointed ahead and to the right. Off the trail on a rocky outcropping, the man was there, standing on the rocks, facing them, perfectly still. Henry could see him more clearly now in daylight, tall, dark clothing, but too distant to make out facial features or details. Something about the complete stillness bothered Henry. Even someone resting would shift weight, adjust their pack, make some small movement. This figure was motionless as a statue. Henry called out, asking if the man was okay, if he needed help. No response. The figure just stood there, watching them. They continued hiking. Neither mentioned the man aloud, but both kept glancing back. After 20 minutes, Amelia looked over her shoulder and gasped. The man was on the trail behind them now, maybe 100 yards back, following, still not moving in any normal way, just appearing in different locations, always facing them, always watching. Henry turned to look. The trail behind them was empty. He told Amelia she must have been mistaken, but she insisted she had seen him clearly. Throughout the day, Amelia kept seeing the figure, sometimes on ridgelines above them, sometimes among the trees to the side of the trail, sometimes behind them, always distant, always still, always watching. Henry never saw him when Amelia pointed, but then he would turn around moments later and catch a glimpse of someone in dark clothing at the edge of visibility. Just a brief sighting before the figure would be obscured by terrain or trees. By afternoon, they were both thoroughly unsettled. The sightings had become too frequent to dismiss. Someone was following them, staying just far enough away to avoid direct confrontation, but maintaining a consistent presence. They discussed hiking out early, cutting their trip short and returning to the trailhead that evening. But they were already 10 miles into the backcountry. Hiking out would take 8 hours minimum, which meant traveling well after dark. The safer option was to reach their planned campsite for the third night, get an early start in the morning, and hike out the final leg to their car. Their third night campsite was at a designated site near the trail, complete with an established tent pad and a bear box for food storage. Another group was already camped there when they arrived, a couple in their 60s who greeted Henry and Amelia warmly. The presence of other people was reassuring. They set up their tent, stored their food properly, and joined the older couple at their campfire for conversation. They did not mention the figure who had followed them all day. It sounded too paranoid, too irrational. But as darkness settled over the camp, Amelia saw him again, at the edge of the firelight, standing among the trees, watching. She grabbed Henry's arm and pointed. This time Henry saw him too. The figure was clearly visible, silhouetted against the lighter darkness of the open forest. Tall, wearing dark clothes or wrapped in shadow, completely motionless. The older couple turned to look where they were pointing. The woman asked what they were looking at. They could not see anyone. Henry stood and grabbed his flashlight, sweeping the beam toward where the figure stood. The light illuminated trees and undergrowth. No person. But Henry had seen him. Amelia had seen him. They were both certain. The older couple exchanged concerned glances. They suggested that sometimes the mind played tricks after a long day of hiking, that shadows could look like people, that exhaustion could cause confusion. Henry and Amelia did not argue. They thanked the couple for their company and retreated to their tent. Neither slept well. They lay awake listening to the night sounds, the rustle of small animals, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of wind. Amelia dozed fitfully, waking repeatedly with the feeling that someone was standing outside their tent. Henry stared at the tent ceiling, tracking every sound, trying to convince himself that stress and fatigue were creating problems where none existed. At 3 a.m, Henry woke from a light sleep to see the figure standing at the entrance to their tent. Not outside, inside. The silhouette was perfectly still, backlit by moonlight filtering through the nylon fabric. A tall shape, facing him, standing just inches from where he lay. Henry could see no features, just darkness in the shape of a man. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He lunged forward, hands reaching to grab or push or defend. His hands passed through empty air. The figure was gone. The tent was empty, except for him and Amelia sleeping beside him. Henry sat gasping, heart hammering, certain of what he had seen but unable to reconcile it with the empty tent around him. He shook Amelia awake and told her what had happened. She believed him. She had felt something too, a presence, a weight in the air that should not have been there. They agreed immediately. They were leaving, right then, in the dark. They did not care about the danger of night hiking. They needed to get out of these mountains. They packed by headlamp, moving quietly to avoid waking the older couple. They left a note thanking them for the hospitality and explaining they had an emergency that required hiking out early. By 4 a.m, they were on the trail, moving as fast as they dared in the darkness. They reached the trailhead as the sun was rising, exhausted and frightened, but safe. They drove home to Seattle in silence, both processing what they had experienced, both trying to find rational explanations that would not come. They told themselves it was over. A strange experience, unsettling but finished. They were home now, safe in their apartment in a city of nearly 4 million people. The wilderness was behind them. Whatever they had seen or thought they had seen was 60 miles away in the mountains. They unpacked their gear, showered, and tried to return to normal life. That night, Amelia woke at 3 a.m. to see the figure standing in their bedroom doorway. The same dark silhouette, the same impossible stillness. Watching her from across the room, she screamed. Henry woke and turned on the light. The doorway was empty, nothing there. But Amelia had seen him as clearly as she had seen anything in her life. The figure from the mountains, in their home. The next night, Henry saw it in their bathroom mirror. The silhouette standing behind him while he brushed his teeth. He spun around, nothing there. But it had been in the reflection, clear and undeniable. Every night for 2 weeks, one of them saw the figure. In doorways, in windows, in reflections, always watching, never moving, never coming closer, but never leaving either. They tried to ignore it, tried to convince themselves it was psychological, some form of shared trauma response. But objects in their apartment began moving. Keys that should have been on the table were on the counter. Doors they had closed were open. A framed photograph of them on their 2nd anniversary fell off the wall and shattered, despite being securely hung. The apartment no longer felt safe. A friend suggested they visit someone who understood these matters, someone from the local native community who knew the old stories about the mountains. Amelia was skeptical, but desperate. They found a woman through a friend of a friend, an elder who listened to their story without interruption. When they finished, she nodded as if she had heard similar accounts before. She told them they had been followed by something that did not want to let them go. Something that had marked them in the mountains and claimed them as its own. Something that existed in the spaces between the living world and whatever came after. The woman performed a cleansing ritual in their apartment. She burned cedar and sage, chanted in a language Henry and Amelia did not understand, and placed small bundles of herbs and stones in the corners of each room. She told them the entity would leave, but the mark would remain. They would always be more visible to such things than ordinary people. They had been touched by something from the mountains, and that touch could not be fully erased. The appearances stopped after the ritual. The figure no longer stood in doorways or appeared in mirrors. The apartment felt lighter, less oppressive. Henry and Amelia wanted to believe it was over. But they both knew something had changed. They saw things in their peripheral vision now. Shadows that moved wrong. Shapes that should not be there but were, just for an instant. They had become sensitized to a layer of reality most people never perceived. They did not go backpacking again. They canceled their permits for future trips. They sold their camping gear. The mountains that had brought them together, that they had loved for years, now felt dangerous in ways they could not explain to friends who asked why they had stopped hiking. They said they had gotten busy with work, that they were interested in other hobbies now. They did not talk about the figure that had followed them home from the Cascades. 6 months later, they moved to a new apartment. Neither admitted it aloud, but both hoped that distance might help. The new place felt cleaner somehow, less haunted. But Amelia still saw shadows sometimes, standing at the edges of rooms. Henry still felt presences in doorways late at night. The mark remained, just as the elder had said it would. Sometimes Amelia wondered if they should have stayed in the mountains, if the figure had been trying to keep them there, if leaving had somehow violated an unspoken agreement. She wondered if other hikers had seen the same silhouette, if other people had been followed home from those trails, if anyone had stayed, surrendering to whatever claimed them in the subalpine meadows and crystal lakes. She never voiced these thoughts to Henry. But late at night, when shadows moved in ways shadows should not move, she wondered. And in the deepest part of her, in the place that had been marked by something old and patient and implacable, she knew that the figure was still watching, still waiting, still holding claim to something it had marked as its own in the mountains, where reality wore thin and ancient things walked freely. The Cascades had not let them go. Not really. They had simply taken the haunting home with them, carried it down from the mountains like a souvenir they could never discard. A reminder that some places claim those who visit, and some things follow you home.